how to deal with founder imposter syndrome. That knot in your stomach when someone says, send us your numbers. It has a name, and almost every founder feels it. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what's happening when that knot shows up, and you'll have 4 practical ways to deal with it, starting today. As a chartered accountant who also runs my own business, I've sat across the table from founders who built something genuinely impressive, real revenue, real customers, a real team, and watched them go quiet the second the conversation turned to the numbers. Not because they weren't capable, but because somewhere along the line, they decided that not instantly understanding a spreadsheet meant they weren't a real founder on some level. Most people assume imposter syndrome is about doubting your abilities in general. For founders, it's usually much more specific than that. It shows up as a fear of being exposed in one particular area, the numbers, while everything else around the business feels solid. You can be completely confident, hiring, selling, building the product or service offering, and still feel a full body knot the moment someone asks you for your financials. Here's the part almost nobody says out loud. Imposter syndrome isn't a sign you don't belong. It's a sign you've never been taught the number language everyone assumes you already speak. So do this. Think of the last time that knot showed up. Write down exactly what triggered it. A specific question, a specific meeting, a specific term you nodded along to. That trigger you just wrote down isn't unique to you. Let's look at exactly how common it actually is and why it hides so well. The gap between how confident founders look and how confident they actually feel. Here's a number that surprises most founders. Research from Xero found that 55% of business owners rate their own financial literacy as high, while their books tell a very different story underneath. Most founders assume everyone else in the room actually understands what's being discussed. In reality, a huge share of that room is performing the same confidence you are, nodding at the same terminology no one wants to admit they don't fully understand. This is what makes founder imposter syndrome so sticky. It's not just a private feeling. It's a room full of people privately having the exact same feeling, each one convinced they're the only one faking. Nobody raises their hand and says, actually, can you explain that? So the performance continues, and everyone leaves the meeting a little more convinced that everyone else has this figured out. The gap isn't between confident founders and anxious ones. It's between how confident founders look in the room and how confident they actually feel walking out of it. And that gap is far more common than it looks from the outside. You're not the only one nodding along. You're just the only one who thinks you're the only one nodding along. So do this. The next time you don't fully understand a financial term in a meeting, ask the question out loud instead of nodding. One sentence. Can you explain what that means? Nodding along feels like the safe option in the moment, but staying quiet about the gap doesn't make it smaller. It actually has the opposite effect. Why staying quiet about what you don't know actually makes it worse. Most founders think avoiding their numbers keeps the anxiety manageable, out of sight, out of mind. One less stressful thing to look at this week. But in reality, the opposite happens. Every week you avoid looking, the gap between what you know and what you need to know to feel confident gets a little wider, and the fear of being asked gets a little louder. This is where real damage happens, not in the not knowing itself, but in the decisions made around it. Founders who are quietly anxious about their numbers tend to avoid the very conversations that would close the gap. Asking their bookkeeper a clarifying question, asking an advisor to explain a term, asking a partner to walk through the P&L together. Each avoided question feels small. Stacked over a year, they add up to a founder who still doesn't actually know whether the business is thriving or quietly struggling, and feels like a fraud discussing either possibility. The fear doesn't get smaller because you've stopped looking at it. It gets smaller the moment you actually look. The fear doesn't shrink when you avoid your numbers. It only shrinks when you look at them. So do this. Pick one number you've been avoiding, your exact current bank balance, or the exact amount you owe on one specific bill. Look it up today, right now if you can. Looking once helps for a day. What actually closes the gap for good is smaller and more repeatable than most founders expect. The habit that actually builds financial confidence. And it isn't learn everything about accounting. Here's the belief that keeps most founders stuck, that confidence has to come first before you're ready to face your numbers. But in practice, it works in the opposite order. Competence first. Confidence is what shows up afterward, once competence has had a chance to build. And competence only builds through small, repeated exposure to your actual numbers, not through waiting to feel ready. You don't need to understand every line of a balance sheet to stop feeling like a fraud. You need one small, consistent habit that puts you in front of your real numbers on a schedule, instead of only in the moments someone else forces the question. 5 minutes once a week, looking at what's actually true, not what you're assuming, not what you're afraid of, is enough to start closing the gap that imposter syndrome lives in. I felt this one myself, and it caught me off guard because of my background. The year I started my own business, I remember a specific meeting where that exact knot showed up. Not over the numbers, because the numbers were the one part I actually knew called. It hit the moment someone asked me to explain my growth strategy, and I froze. Being a chartered accountant didn't protect me from feeling like a fraud. That's the part nobody tells you about imposter syndrome. It doesn't care what you're actually qualified in. It finds whatever room you haven't stood in enough times yet, and it waits there. You don't need to know everything about your numbers. You need to stop avoiding the ones that scare you. The more you understand your numbers, the more you build competence, and the more confidently you can discuss them in different rooms. It gets easier the more you do it. At least that's what I've learned. So do this. Block 5 minutes this week for a first look. Not a deep dive, just a look. The free 7-day CEO Cash Audit is built to make that first look this easy. If you want the smallest possible first step into your own numbers, I've built exactly that. I've put together a free 7-day CEO Cash Audit, a 5-minute look at your last 7 days of cash activity that gives you a CEO stability rating and a 30-day forward view, so you're not guessing anymore. Grab it using the link in the description or comment numbers below, and I'll send it your way. Last week, I said I'd get personal this time. I built Level Up a Life because I spent years watching founders, smart, capable, genuinely impressive founders, go quiet in exactly the way I just described, and watching it cost them. Harder conversations with investors, decisions made on guesswork instead of real numbers, businesses that could have been more resilient than they were. That's the whole reason this channel exists, to help founders get clear on their numbers, get positioned for the funding and decisions that actually move the business forward, and build something built to last.